is Brian Cannon. I direct the Charles Red Center for Western Studies here at BYU, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's lecture. The Red Center sponsors research, publication, teaching, and public programs related to the American West and a variety of academic disciplines. It was established through a generous grant from Charlie and Annalee Red, who were Utah ranchers and philanthropists back in 1972. Today's lecture is named in honor of William Howard and Hazel Butler Peters, who were civic leaders in Glendale, California. Their children, Susan and Dennis, both attended BYU, and the Peters family generously provided a bequest to the Red Center to promote Western history and Western studies here on the campus. Members of the Peters family are here today, and we extend a special welcome to them. We'll begin with an opening prayer. Amy Carlin, the office specialist in the Red Center, will offer that. And then my colleague in the Red Center, Brenda Rensley, will introduce today's lecture.
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for the opportunity that we have to be gathered here together to be edified. We're grateful for this university and the opportunities that it gives us. We are grateful that Professor Madley was able to join us to present today's lecture, and we ask thy blessing on him, that he may present all he desires to, and we ask that our minds may be open to receive knowledge. We love thee and say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
I'm grateful to be able to introduce our speaker today. Professor Benjamin Madley is a historian of Native America, the United States, and colonialism in world history. He was born in Northern California and spent much of his childhood in Karuk country near the Oregon border, which grew his interest in the relationship between colonizers and indigenous peoples. He earned a bachelor's from Yale University, his master's degrees from Oxford, and then his doctorate from Yale University as well. After serving as an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College, he began teaching history and American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he is currently an associate professor. He writes about American Indians as well as colonialism in Africa, Australia, and Europe, often applying a transnational and comparative approach, which, if you know my background, is right up my alley. He's an author of a dozen published essays, 4 have appeared in edited volumes, and another 8 in journals, ranging from the American Historical Review to the Journal of Genocide Research and the Pacific Historical Review. In 2016, Yale University Press published his first book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. We have a few of those copies available for sale, and he's more than happy to sign them for you if you'd like after the lecture. This book has received a number of awards, and I suspect is about to receive a bunch more. It received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History, the Raphael Lemkin Book Award from the Institute for the Study of Genocide, the California Book Awards Gold Medal for Californiana, and the Heyday Books History Award. It's also been named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, an Indian Country Today Hot List Book, and a Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Title. True West Magazine recently named him the Best New Western Author of 2016. On a more personal note, about a decade ago, when I was working on my master's thesis, the point of my thesis was that we needed, in Native North America, new studies about genocide in Native North America, and that we were severely lacking good academic works. And it's been with great gratification that books like this by Professor Madley and a number of others have kind of, I don't think he answered the call, he likely was not aware of my master's thesis, but they've in a way answered this call of this amazing research that is much needed, not just for Native North America, but for global and comparative genocide studies. So join me in welcoming Dr. Madley.
Thank you, Brenda.
We also like to present him with this plaque for the Hazel Butler Peters lecture, which you can hang proudly in your office somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll take as the back.
Okay.
For you.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here, and I appreciate your interest in my work. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in Indian country. We're on Shoshone and Ute land, I believe, and wherever you go in the great state of Utah, you'll be in Indian country. In fact, wherever you go in the United States or in the entire hemisphere, from the Arctic Ocean to the very tip of Patagonia, you will be on someone's ancient ancestral lands, lands that have been inhabited by indigenous peoples for many thousands of years. So that's one thing I hope, if anything, you'll take away from this is a little sense about the fact that you're living in a place that's been inhabited by people for a very, very long time and that still remains Indian country. The second thing that I'd like to preface this talk with is to acknowledge that for some people in the room, the trauma that we're about to unpack this afternoon together is very real and is ongoing. It inhabits people's waking lives and it inhabits their dream world, their interpersonal relationships. So if at any point someone needs to get up and leave, to take a moment outside to say a prayer, that will be fine with me. And if somebody needs to get up from the audience while they're hearing this talk, please be considerate and polite and give them space to leave the room. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by the central fire, celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, the women's clamshell necklaces, as you see here in this photo, clicking softly against their beaded seashell dresses. Male dancers dressed as birds, deer, and hunters supported the women in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, the singers stopped periodically to raise their voices toward the heavens in the ancient formulas of knee dash, the feather dance, giving thanks not only for the original creation of this beautiful world in which we live, but also for its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the singers stopped and the dancers walked away from the fires. They made their way into snug redwood plank houses through round doors. The Taloa people who hosted this celebration then bedded down next to kith and kin, unaware that less than 8 miles away, white men in Crescent City in northwestern California were preparing to launch the next sortie in California's ever-expanding war of extermination against indigenous peoples. In the pre-dawn hours of the very last day of 1854, as many as 116 volunteer state militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of auxiliaries, quietly surrounded the village. They took up positions, concealing themselves behind dunes, within the brush, or behind boulders and rocks. As men, women, and children emerged from those redwood houses to begin the day, the militiamen and their allies opened fire. They shot them down, says one eyewitness participant, quote, just as fast as we could reload our rifles. When the screaming and the shooting ended, hundreds of people were dead. Not more than 5 seem to have survived. In contrast, the attackers suffered a single casualty, and the state of California later paid the militiamen for their work. Between the years 1846 and 1870, the California Indian population plummeted from perhaps 150,000 people to somewhere around 30,000. Now, diseases, starvation, and dislocation all played important roles in this demographic catastrophe. But forced labor, abduction, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, battles, and over 300 separate massacres also took the lives of many thousands and hindered biological reproduction. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. The 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And it specifies these particular crimes. The convention, while imperfect, provides scholars with an internationally recognized rubric for evaluating possible instances of genocide, including those that took place before 1948 and thus cannot be tried as genocide cases. But they're also important because they get us to think about history in different ways. Following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began to re-examine and reinterpret the colonization of California under US rule. And by the year 2000, more than 20 scholars had deemed what happened in California between 1846 and 1873 to indeed have been a case of genocide. So why devote 10 years of my life to writing this not insubstantial book? You can use it to get bigger biceps or to hold open a door if you need to. The reason that I think so much detail is necessary is because the question of genocide matters. It matters because the stakes associated with the question of genocide are extraordinarily high. For scholars, there are a variety of questions that we have to address when we think about genocide in California. If the state of California was founded on genocide, scholars will need to re-examine some of the basic assumptions that we have about California Indian history. And one of the basic assumptions is the idea that's quite widespread, that it was disease that was the primary killer of Indian peoples, that caused that massive population crash. Scholars also, if we accept that this is a case of genocide, need to re-examine the assumptions that United States history is somehow exceptionalist, that United States history is not like the colonial histories filled with genocide of other countries. I'm thinking of places like Australia, for example. A careful study of genocide in California will also help scholars in examining the larger hemispheric indigenous population catastrophe that took place in both North and South America. Where scholars document genocide, it then becomes necessary to carefully evaluate what roles governments, central and regional and local, played, as well as whether or not killing was part of a national, regional, or even hemispheric pattern. Larger questions then follow. What tends to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who carried out the killing? Why don't we know more about these events? Did democracy drive the process of mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of the modern United States, Canada, Mexico, and the other nation states of the Americas? The genocide question is particularly urgent for California's approximately 150,000 California Indian people. Should they press for government apologies, monetary reparations, and control of land where genocidal events took place? How will tribes choose to marshal evidence of genocide in federal and state cases involving sovereignty and recognition? How should California Indian communities commemorate the many victims of mass murder while also emphasizing successful accommodation, resistance, survival, and cultural renewal? The psychological issues related to genocide are also fraught. What happens when a tribal member learns that she is the descendant of both genocide survivors and genocide perpetrators? How might California Indian people reconcile increased knowledge of the genocide that took place in their homelands, often at the hands of the United States government, with their frequently intense patriotism and high levels of participation in the United States Armed Forces? Finally, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have on intergenerational historical trauma, that trauma that is so prevalent in California Indian communities, and that trauma's direct connection to present-day illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the highest rate of suicide of any group of people living in California today? The question of genocide in California under US rule also poses, I would argue, explosive questions for all people living in the United States. Should federal government officials tender public apologies as did Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1980s for the forced relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War? Should federal officials offer some kind of compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has now allocated to those internees and their descendants? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indians' $7.3 billion a year in annual gaming revenues as one way of paying monetary reparations for the state's involvement in genocide? A better understanding of the genocide that took place in California might also impact the federal government's dealings with the 73 separate California Indian communities that are currently seeking to be officially recognized by the federal government in Washington, D.C. Now, the question of commemoration is closely linked. Will non-Indian people support or even tolerate the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of California's founding fathers with the same kinds of monuments, memorials, public days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in public discourse or in public school curricula? These questions are all extraordinarily important, but they can only be addressed in very limited ways without a comprehensive understanding of the systematic mass violence that took place in California between 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of U.S. rule in California. But it was James Marshall's famous, or infamous, depending upon how you see it, 1848 gold strike that precipitated a local genocide. Oregon men coming south to participate in the gold rush played a leading role in increasing the violence against California Indian people. Why? Because they rarely had connections to California's long-standing tradition of colonialism under Mexico, under Spain, and under Russia, embracing indigenous people as laborers, as central to California's colonial economies. And these newcomers, especially Oregonians, came to California with the understanding that indigenous people posed not only a violent threat, but an obstacle to the rapid acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indian people increased in both lethality and frequency, particularly in the central mines where the gold rush was now booming. The central mines are this area of the map that we see here. One 49er explained in a journal entry, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California they did shoot them freely." That April, one miner entered the epicenter of this local genocide in Coloma, near the point where gold had originally been found, about here. In the central mines, this miner and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings and beheadings of California Indian people, and the slaying of captured California Indian women and children. Now, due to spotty primary source coverage, there weren't yet any newspapers being published in these regions. We will never know the exact number of California Indian people murdered by whites in and around the mines in late 1849 and early 1850, but hundreds, if not thousands, may have suffered violent deaths. What was absolutely clear to observers was the exterminatory nature of these attacks, both in their impact and in their intentionality. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo people living here near Clear Lake at Big Valley Ranch, what is now Kelseyville, were being held as unfree laborers under appalling conditions. People were being worked to death, women were being systematically raped, and people were being shot and tortured to death. In response to these horrible conditions, they killed the two white ranchers who held them. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and regular United States Army soldiers killed as many as 1,000 Indian people or more, just between Christmas 1849 and May 15, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers in the Sonoma and Napa valleys, the areas now famous for their wineries. Then, after authorities arrested some of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court, in its very first case, let all 8 men go on bail and never sought to actually try them. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white ranchers. In an article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one newspaper described the massacre committed by the United States Army on Clear Lake, using information directly provided by a United States Army captain, and I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age was spared. It was the order of extermination, fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 California Indian people died that day. Other killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured. In fact, they were all promoted. So a new factor was at work: large-scale, extended vigilante and United States Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into California. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or 14,000 non-Indian people living within the borders of what is now California. But by the year 1860, census takers counted over 360,000. This was, in fact, the single largest mass migration in the United States of the 19th century. Now, the newcomers came primarily in search of wealth. They were looking for that yellow material, gold. But in seeking to access gold, dress, eat, acquire labor, and satisfy their sexual desires, they placed immense pressures upon California's indigenous communities. And these demands triggered an explosion of ranching, hunting, mining, and most lethally, slave raiding. These activities generated the shock waves that had devastating impacts upon California Indian peoples. But California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, U.S. military officers made California Indians into second-class subjects, not citizens, but subjects with few rights. California's 1849 Constitution, written here in this building, which you can still visit today in Monterey, California, then made it nearly impossible for California Indian people to vote. And when California's legislature met for the first time in early 1850, one of their very first acts was to bar California Indian people from voting, to bar California Indian people of 1/2 or more Indian blood from serving for or against whites in court cases. And they later barred California Indians from serving as jurors and serving as attorneys. So in combination, these laws largely shut Indian people out of participation in and protection by the state's legal system. And abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In another act, also passed in early 1850, state legislatures legalized the white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing courts and juries, which remember had no Indian participation by design, to summarily reject all Indian testimony. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges. What we're looking at here is actually an advertisement for the sale of a California Indian teenage girl of the age of 16 years old. It comes from Southern California, in the area where I live. In 1860, legislators extended that original act to legalize the indenture of any Indian. These laws, in combination, this 1850 law and this 1860 law, triggered a statewide boom in unfree Indian labor, while separating men and women during peak reproductive years, both of which accelerated California's ongoing Indian population decline. Some Indian people were even treated as disposable slave laborers. One lawyer recalled, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its weekly slave mart, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way." And he wasn't exaggerating. Census takers tell us that between the year 1850 and the year 1870, California's Indian population, or excuse me, Los Angeles's Indian population plummeted from 3,693 people to just 219 people. Now, escape was one way that California Indians defied servitude, but whites often responded with lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki woman Lucy Young, whose portrait we're looking at here in this slide, she escaped servitude multiple times. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hung down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither," end quote. Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, "lord and master" with his Indian boy in 1858, whites responded by massacring an entire village of 15 California Indian people. 2 years later, a rancher became so incensed when his Indian servant went 2 miles away to visit his family that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family, 6 persons, boy and all," end quote. Despite such reports, which appeared with alarming frequency in California newspapers, federal and state officials almost always failed to intervene. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable. In 1851 and 1852, federal Indian agents, the gentleman that you see in the front of this picture here, signed 18 treaties with 119 separate California Indian communities up and down the state, allocating them 7,488,000 acres, or approximately 7.5% of the land area of the state. And you can see these reservations. They're the gray areas inside the white. Those were all going to be reservations. But when these treaties reached the United States Senate, meeting in a closed-door session, the Senate repudiated all of the treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized 5 military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each. So we go from approximately 7.5 million acres to not more than 125,000 acres. And crucially, they conferred no land title or legal recognition to California Indian communities. The results were fourfold. First, no reservations were patented, and jurisdiction over those temporary military reservations was left uncertain. Second, because jurisdiction was left so uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among state and federal authorities prevailed. Third, and this is very important, California Indians did not become the explicit legal wards of the federal government. Finally, United States Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of California reservation legal status denied them the United States Army's protection. And I quote, this is an order he sent out to all of his officers in California. "Until these reservations are perfected, that is, made into official federal land, United States troops have no right to enter or exclude whites from entering and occupying the reserves, or even to prevent them taking Indians, including women and children." Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to kidnapping, slavery, assault, homicide, and massacre. But it was the establishment of California's militia system that now built up a statewide killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 California militiamen participated in 24 separate volunteer militia operations against California Indian people. And these operations killed an absolute minimum of 1,342 California Indians. But the impact of these state militia operations transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity for those who sought to kill California Indians, and inspiring many more vigilante killers. In fact, vigilantes killed far more California Indian people than the militia did, an absolute minimum of 6,400 individuals. Now, as I was doing the research on this book, for a while I thought, okay, there are a lot of people who are out of control and there's not enough centralized authority in California. Maybe that's what's happening. The old story of the Wild West. But this is patently not true in California. In January of 1851, this charming gentleman, California's first civilian elected governor, Peter Burnett, declared, and I quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. The following month, state legislators put the power of the purse behind the governor's declaration, agreeing to spend $500,000, an extraordinarily large amount of money at this time, by far the single largest line item in the state's budget, on California state militia operations against California Indians. Meanwhile, state legislators began building up an arsenal of weapons and ammunition donated to the state militias by the United States Army. In 1852, United States Senator John Weller, representing California, who had become the state's governor in 1858, publicly told his fellow United States senators in Washington, D.C., that California Indians will be exterminated. And he insisted, the interest of the white man demands their extermination. That same year, state legislators passed a second $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations against California Indians. The Sinkyone Indian woman Sally Bell, whose portrait we see here, provided a rare California eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in her homeland in the 1850s. Bell recollected, and I quote, about 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister, and they cut her heart out, and they threw it into the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was just a baby. She was just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there for a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands. It was a terrifying, terrifying time to be a California Indian. The United States Congress now endorsed such killing. In 1854, Congress allocated over $924,000 to reimburse the state of California for its past militia expeditions against California Indians. Even as state and federal leaders worked to perfect the efficiency of the killing machine. That year, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William Kibbe, this is his official calling card that he would give to people when he visited them, the man who ran California's state militia system from 1852 to 1863, underscored the militia's genocidal purpose. This is how he explained it to the state legislature, and I quote, there are but two alternatives before us, either to wage a war of extermination or to abandon a large and productive territory. To help perfect the killing machine, Kibbe wrote, had published, and distributed a militia manual on tactics to all of his officers throughout the state. Meanwhile, then Secretary of State Jefferson Davis, who later became the president of the Confederacy, sent Kibbe a box of U.S. Army tactical manuals to be distributed as Christmas gifts to his officers. Then in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for more militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in the year 1861, even in the midst of the expanding American Civil War, the United States Congress appropriated another $400,000 to give to the state of California for its militia operations. Civilians and officials also carried out large force removal operations against California Indian people during these years. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 Indian people in the process of forcibly removing one community to the Mendocino Reservation in northwestern California. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoimut from the Central Valley recollected that during the forced removal of her community to the Fresno Indian Reservation, soldiers killed 12 Indians. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man, Andrew Freeman, explained that, and I quote, When they took the Indian people to Round Valley, they drove them like stock, and they shot the old people who could not make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting too tired. Once at reservations, California Indian people routinely encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to the Mendocino Reservation, and I quote, "We were very hungry, and the Concows began to die very fast." Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem took his people south to the Round Valley Reservation in hopes of finding food there. But he recollected that at Round Valley there was even less to eat. Indeed, in 1860, federal officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Reservation Indians. By 1862, rations there had fallen to 160 to 390 calories per day. Now, if some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, chronic malnutrition profoundly weakened the immune systems of many others, making them particularly vulnerable to the many pathogens that were present in the reservations. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing both miscarriages and stillbirths. Some reservation officials and colonists also used federal reservation Indians as unpaid laborers with lethal results. According to one colonist providing testimony in a court of martial law, and I quote, "About 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow and mud. They were typically worked naked and packed 55 pounds if able." At California Indian reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of Indian lives. But federal employees also killed large numbers of California Indian people in more direct ways. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 white California men volunteered to join the Union Army. Thousands of them remained in California throughout the war, and they soon transformed California's killing machine. As United States troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced comparatively small, short-term state militia campaigns with much longer and more lethal Army operations. The Army now fielded the most sustained California Indian hunting operations yet seen. Vigilante operations flourished alongside these federal campaigns, but the genocide was now primarily the project of the United States government. And United States Army forces killed substantial numbers. The first California Volunteers campaign in 1862 killed at least 120 California Indians in just 2 weeks. Hundreds more would die in succeeding campaigns led by officers like this man, Colonel Henry M. Black. United States Army soldiers also killed surrendered California Indians on multiple occasions. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how in 1863, near Bakersfield, California, quote, "I had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabred, none escaped." McLaughlin concluded, "They will soon all be either killed off or driven so far into the surrounding deserts that they shall perish by famine." The United States Army continued killing California Indians through the late 1860s. Even after officers concluded their last major Indian hunting campaign, the 1872 to 1873 Modoc War, they hanged and beheaded 4 surrendered Modoc leaders before shipping their severed heads to an Army collection in Washington, D.C. The California Indian catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated, both in word and in deed, intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed all 5 genocidal acts enumerated in the Convention. killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 separate massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that in total, between 1846 and 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and soldiers killed at least 9,462 to 16,094 California Indian people, and likely many, many more. By way of contrast, California Indians killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indian people during this entire period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of systematically demolishing California Indian villages and destroying their food stores while driving California Indian survivors into inhospitable deserts and mountain regions amounted to deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's destruction in whole or in part. Some Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same kind of genocidal crimes. Further, because malnutrition and physical exposure predictably lowered fertility while increasing the numbers of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, slave raiders, federal officials, and others were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced removals. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence exists then to designate the California Indian catastrophe a case of genocide according to the UN Genocide Convention. Now I'd like to stop there to give us time to have some discussion about this and to answer some of your questions. Don't be shy, I won't bite you.
So, obviously, any efforts that may have been perpetrated to stop this killing didn't really result successfully, but are there any, again, people that, obviously saw this conscious shattering stuff going on around them?
Absolutely, it's a terrific question. I tried wherever I found somebody resisting, either in action or in word or in print, the killing, to document it. In part because I felt that it was so important to show that there were many individuals who saw that this was morally wrong. This was a sinful, terrible thing that was happening. But also to show how they were stopped. So there were people ranging from senators in the US Senate to congressmen to state legislators to journalists who really tried to stop this. But they were constantly overwhelmed by the very strong annihilationist anti-Indian sentiment of their fellow legislators and fellow journalists. So those people who resisted the mass murder always were vastly outnumbered. But it's important to understand that, if you read the book, you'll see there are these moments, these incredible turning points. When California is making its constitution in 1849, 3 times they come within a single vote of giving Indians rights. In one instance, which I detail in the book, they come within a single vote of making Indians citizens. They were looking at Wisconsin as an example where Indians had been given citizenship and had been enfranchised in the 1840s. But it didn't happen. So one of the things that this story, I think, reveals is the importance of participation in the democratic system, because we get the leaders that we elect. And so when they had this crucial vote to decide whether or not Indians would become citizens, some of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention had left early to go drink and carouse. If those gentlemen had been there, maybe California history would have turned out very differently. There are also some moments in the book where white people put their lives on the line to protect California Indians. There's one story that I think about all the time. The death squad comes to a ranch near Redding in Northern California, near the place where I was born. And the death squads are going around killing all the Indian workers at every ranch and every farm in the northern Sacramento Valley, quite systematically. They come to this ranch, they go into the barn and they kill all the men who are working at threshing wheat. And then they come into the house to kill the women. And the white woman who is their employer, who is pregnant, stands in front of 4 women holding a quilt open to hide them. And she says, if you want to kill these women, you'll have to kill me and my unborn child as well. And the killers couldn't do it. And they left. And her husband came in from the field, and they were able to rescue these women by taking them in a wagon 35 miles away into the mountains to a place of safety and to a Wintu community that they knew was hiding out up in the hills. So I think these stories of resistance are incredibly important. And there are people who also hid Indian children and hid women and men, to protect them from being killed. But unfortunately, those stories are far too few and far between. Yes.
You mentioned that there's still tribes waiting for recognition.
That's correct.
What are the factors that are contributing to that, and why is that the case?
Well, federal recognition is a very complicated challenge. There are multiple ways to go about achieving federal recognition. A community can directly petition the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A community can also get an act of Congress to recognize them. There can also be an executive order that can recognize them. But the process takes a long time. I'm helping the Tataviam of the San Fernando Valley, who are right over the hill from UCLA. There are a number of us on the faculty in American Indian Studies who are helping them to gather the important information. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs is very, very tough on this, and they make it extraordinarily hard. One of the things that I hope this book brings forward is to explain to people at the BIA that it's very difficult for California Indian communities to prove continuity of existence. Why? Because the state and federal government tried to physically exterminate them. And now the federal government is acting the survivors, the descendants of the survivors of this genocide, to bring forward all this evidence about their continuity in place and their ability to maintain all the things that the BIA asked for. But it's quite bizarre because it's the federal government that paid all the money and provided the weapons and often carried out the exact killing. So, this book has a quite overtly political purpose, which is to be a set of documents that can exist that California Indian communities can utilize in federal and state court cases.
So this recognition that many California Native American groups are looking for, is it recognition as official tribes, or are they looking to get fishing and land rights, or what exactly are they looking for?
So there are scores of California Indian communities who are recognized as California Indian nations by the state of California, by Sacramento, but not by the federal government. And this happens in a lot of states have California Indian communities that are recognized by a state legislature and a state government, but not by the federal government. Recognition by the federal government comes with a lot of rights and privileges, the most important of which, central thing, is political sovereignty. To be a nation within a nation and to have direct nation-to-nation relations with the federal government. But I mean, this is a huge topic, but these are some of the cornerstones of the reason.
So does Union government actions in the 19th century, the genocide, does that have any legal ramifications for existing unrecognized groups in California?
That's a really good question. You can't have a crime without a pre-existing law. That's a basic treatise of Western legal thought, and it's the way that we apply that idea here in California. So even perpetrators of the Holocaust have never been tried under the UN Genocide Convention. The crime has to be committed after the International Legal Treaty was ratified in 1948. But I do think that it provides a very important moral framework for thinking about what happened in California and comparing it, for example, to the genocide in Rwanda, the genocide in Armenia, or the Holocaust, other like events. And we have at a very interesting moment last spring in April, the governor of California, Jerry Brown, brought me to Sacramento, and I gave a similar book talk in the state capitol. And as a result of that, he has acknowledged that a genocide took place in California during these years by the state and federal governments. That's a very important first step, but I think that the next step we need is an official apology. And then we have to talk very seriously about what the state of California and what the United States owe to California Indian people as a result of the crimes that were committed against them. Officially sanctioned, systematic crimes against all of the California Indian nations.
Regionally within California, where there's some areas where it was, I hate to use the term more egregious, because I grew up in the San Diego area,
Right.
and I'm aware of some of the native populations there. In our textbooks, we get through the Spanish colonial period and where the Indians were at that time, and then there's just sort of
Okay, so
something after that.
I don't want to get involved in the suffering Olympics because that doesn't really lead anywhere. But what I can say is that in the beginning of the book, I provide a background to California history before 1846. In that, what I call the Russo-Iberian period, the period of Spanish, Russian, and Mexican colonization, the California Indian population plummets from perhaps 300,000 to 150,000. Why? In part because of the missions. We know that in the missions, over 68,000 people were died. So about 80,000 were baptized by the Franciscan fathers in the missions, and of those 80,000, 68,000 plus died. So the missions were extraordinarily lethal. But they also had a devastating demographic impact on all of coastal California and into the interior. So coastal California from, say, San Francisco south to San Diego saw far fewer killings than did the rest of California between 1846 and 1873, but in large part because that population had already been hit so hard by Russian, Mexican, and Spanish colonialism and diseases. There are massive disease epidemics that crush thousands and thousands of California Indian people, separate from violence. And it's also important to recognize that, especially under the Mexicans, there are many massacres that took place against California Indians. The United States and newcomers during the Gold Rush weren't the first people to massacre the indigenous inhabitants of California.
So did they lean on that as a precedent for their behavior?
Yeah, one of the arguments of the book is that the Mexican and Spanish systems establish a whole set of legal and practical precedents for how California Indians will be treated, but that the U.S. policy in California is a hybridity of previous Indian policies brought from further east with these existing Russo-Iberian policies and practices. Yeah. Yes.
I'm actually from Santa Rosa originally myself, in California, and I'm only beginning to kind of discover this kind of history behind all this and history since I grew up on the farm. But I guess, like I'm not sure aware of like how the U.S. or any conference people utilize Native American allies in their conquest, or at what level or was it?
Well,
one of the mainly independent?
Yeah, one of the things that is interesting about this genocide is that there's not a lot of use of indigenous auxiliaries to carry out the mass killing. There is some, but it's pretty minimal, I think. It doesn't end up being something that I found a lot of. Reviewers somehow, one reviewer thought I was sort of hiding indigenous participation as auxiliaries or as collaborators, but I don't think that's a major theme in the way the killing was carried out. Why? Because there were so many newcomers, so they weren't short of hands to pull the triggers and wield the hatchets and hold the knives. They generally had overwhelming numbers to do so, particularly after 1850. So some of these militia operations are big. You know, they're in the hundreds and hundreds of people. They have the monetary clout to buy whole barrels of gunpowder at once, and they're being given scores of rifles and muskets and pistols. So they're not really short-handed to do the killing.
What reparations do you recommend, or are reparations at this point
Well, as I suggested, one thing that I think the state of California could do, although I think Jerry Brown has done a much better job than previous governors as he has renegotiated many of the compacts with our state's gaming nations, is to cut down on the state's take from the gaming. It's a huge, huge amount of money that the state takes from California Indian tribes through the compacts. And I think that could be lessened. But I think the federal government ultimately bears the bedrock responsibility for this genocide, because the Army could at any time have stopped this process. Or Congress could have simply chosen not to give California all this reimbursement money, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They could have told the officers that instead of being promoted for killing California Indians, they would be censured, court-martialed, and imprisoned for committing these crimes. But they didn't do those things. So I think the federal government bears a huge amount of responsibility. And there's a lot of different ways that a reparations process could go. But the first thing that we need from the federal government is a direct acknowledgement of the kind that Governor Jerry Brown in California made in April of this year. That's, I think, the first step.
Kind of going along with reparations, how likely is this information, if not already, being implemented in the public education?
So we just had a new California public education bill, but it somehow overlooked California Indian people. There is a new bill that is making its way through the House, the Assembly of California, which is an assembly bill to modify the state's curriculum to bring California Indian people in. Even if we don't teach the genocide, the amount of education that we're providing to our youth in California about its indigenous people is appallingly tiny. If you hold out your arm, all of this is human history in California, and the only part that involves people with my skin color, people from Europeans, is the little white part at the edge of your fingernail. But this is the edge of your fingernail, that white part. That's all we teach to our youth in California's public schools. So a revamping is desperately needed that will bring California Indian people into the educational system in a major way, to bring their history. We're talking about, at an absolute minimum, 12,000 years of human history in California, and as many believe, it's human history since time immemorial. But we don't teach that in California. So I think that curricular reform is very important, and we need to get away from the Mission Project, which is this much talked about fourth grade project where you build a model mission out of toothpicks, and it's a huge business, you know. We need to get away from that, and instead we ought to really be integrating indigenous history, and not just teaching it in the fourth grade, but teaching it K through 12, making it an integral part of how we discuss California's very rich kaleidoscope of human cultures. Our children are missing out on an incredibly wonderful story. I mean, think of the diversity of California. We're talking about possibly the most linguistically diverse place on the planet Earth. At least 60 languages. Some linguists believe there are over 100 separate languages in California. We're talking about 60 different major nations all with different cuisines, different ways of dressing, different ideas about cosmology. You know, it's an incredibly sophisticated, complex set of societies, but we're not telling people about that. So we're missing out on the richness of California's much longer indigenous history.
You addressed this a little bit, but how did the Mexican American War play into this? Were there tribes that supported Mexicans, and so that might have been a potential motive for some of the violence, or?
Well, Mexican colonialism in California was very thin. It was mostly along the coastal strip between Santa Rosa and San Diego. But there had been a lot of intermarriage. So Indians actually had, according to Mexican law, citizenship. So they could be jurors, they could serve as witnesses. They had legal protections because they were citizens. They were technically enfranchised. And so people of mixed indigenous and Mexican European ancestry were actually leaders in California during the Mexican period. So we're really seeing a revolutionary turn, a diminution of rights, and a massive increase in the level of violence. Yeah.
So I'm from Texas, and in history we learned in 4th and 7th grade about Texas history.
Yeah.
And so we learned that things happened to Native Americans, but we don't actually understand what actually happened. How important do you think it is that instead of just knowing that it happened, we understand what actually happened?
Well, there's a big difference between myth and reality. And in American Indian history, the gulf is particularly wide, certainly in the public sphere. So, take Texas history, for example. We have a book that is filled with a lot of problems, Empire of the Summer Moon, about Comanche history, which has been sold in, you'll see it in an airport bookstore, but many fewer people have read Beckett Hämäläinen's Comanche Empire, which is a far more interesting, much more accurate book. Or The Conquest of Texas by Gary Clayton Anderson, which really reveals a much more accurate, truer history of the Texas Rangers and their relations to indigenous peoples than a lot of television shows and movies would. So in writing and researching American Indian history, we're constantly swimming against the current of media, the current of books, films, TV shows, comic books, all kinds of mythological representations of the relations between indigenous native peoples and newcomers. And I think that's part of why American Indian history is a rapidly expanding and thriving field, because there's such an extraordinary amount of work that needs to be done in order to reveal the actual real history and overturn the kind of triumphalist history of the United States, which celebrates colonialism and still basically explains the conquest and colonization of the United States as something wrought primarily by regrettable but inevitable biological forces and the destruction that they wrought through pandemics. There's still very little attention paid to the actual intentional violence against indigenous people by which all of their lands and resources were taken and their population radically diminished. Okay, I think we're out of time. So
Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.